Japan's debt crisis nearly destroyed it. But what actually saved the nation wasn't what you've been told. The standard story is clean. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 modernized Japan, built railways and factories, and through sheer industrial will, the government paid down its debts and became a world power by 1900. Textbooks paint it as a triumph of discipline and planning. Except that's only half the picture. The real mechanism, the one that actually moved the needle, was far stranger, and it reveals something uncomfortable about how governments escape debt traps. This isn't about what Japan did right. It's about what they did that worked and why. When the Meiji government took power in 1868, Japan wasn't just in debt, it was fractured. The old feudal system had collapsed. Thousands of samurai were suddenly unemployed. Regional daimyo lords had their own treasuries, their own debts, their own grievances. The new central government inherited all of it. The math was brutal. Massive military obligations, zero modern tax base, and a population that had no experience with centralized taxation. On paper, Japan looked insolvent. Here's where the received wisdom takes over. Japan modernized, built infrastructure, grew its economy, paid off debt. And yes, they did build railways. The Takedo line opened in 1872. Factories rose. But here's the detail everyone glosses over. Those projects barely turned a profit for decades. They were money sinks. So where did the cash come from? That's where the story breaks. The first lever was currency manipulation. In 1872, Japan adopted the yen and pegged it to silver. And this is crucial, they didn't have enough silver backing. The government printed yen anyway. Inflation followed. By the 1880, the yen had lost about 40% of its value against gold. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. And it worked like a hidden tax on savers and foreign creditors. Think about it. If you loaned money to Japan in 1872 expecting repayment in stable currency, and you got paid back in 1880 with depreciated yen, you lost real wealth. But Japan's debt burden measured in yen shrank on paper. It's a transfer. The creditors and savers bore the cost so the government could meet obligations. Nobody calls it default because technically it wasn't. The payments arrived on time. They were just worth less. But currency games alone don't explain the full escape. The second mechanism was taxation, not gentle taxation. The Meiji government implemented a land tax in 1873 that was ruthless. Rural farmers, who made up 80% of the population, suddenly owed a percentage of their harvest directly to the state. No exceptions, no negotiation. This wasn't a loan program or a debt restructuring. It was extraction. The land tax generated steady revenue, yes, but it also sparked rural rebellion. Between 1873 and 1878, there were over 200 recorded peasant uprisings. The government responded with military force. These weren't minor skirmishes, but they're almost never mentioned in the Japan modernized peacefully narrative. The debt was paid partly on the backs of people who literally revolted against it. Now here's the third lever, and it's the most overlooked. Zaibatsu, massive conglomerate corporations like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo. The government didn't just privatize. It handed state enterprises to these families at fire sale prices. Shipyards, mines, telegraph networks. Why? Because the families had capital and the government needed it. It was a deal. You buy these assets cheap, you become rich, and you funnel profits back into the state's coffers through taxes and loans. This created a symbiosis. The zaibatsu needed government protection and military contracts to thrive. The government needed zaibatsu wealth to service debt. They grew together. By 1900, these family conglomerates controlled a huge share of Japan's economy. They were wealthy beyond measure, but they were also tethered to the state. Independence wasn't an option. This arrangement lasted until 1945. So by 1900, Japan had indeed paid down its debt. Officially, the books looked balanced. But what had actually happened? Currency had been debased. Farmers had been taxed to the brink of rebellion. Wealth had been concentrated into a handful of families in exchange for state loyalty. The economy had grown, yes, but growth was a byproduct, not the engine of debt relief. Here's what this means for how we understand debt crises. They don't get solved by virtue alone. They get solved by transfer. Someone pays. In Japan's case, it was savers who lost to inflation, farmers who lost to taxation, and ordinary citizens who lost autonomy when the state and zaibatsu became one entity. The debt didn't vanish. It moved. And the people who moved it paid the price. When modern governments talk about managing debt or growing out of it, they are often describing the same process. Inflation erodes the real value of debt. Taxation shifts the burden. Privatization creates winners who then support the system. Japan just did it faster and more visibly because it had to. It was starting from zero institutional credibility in 1868. By 1900, it had built a machine. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. If you want to understand how lending systems shape societies, from feudal Japan to modern credit markets, subscribe. There's a new deep dive into the history and mechanics of debt every week. Subscribe. There's a new deep dive into how lending systems shape societies every week. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.